The individual known to history as Winston Churchill was born Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill on November 30th, 1874, at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, one of England's most exquisite stately homes. His father was Lord Randolph Churchill, who belonged to one of England's most distinguished noble families. He was a descendant of John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, a renowned soldier and statesman whose military career spanned the reigns of 5 monarchs in the 17th and early 18th centuries. John Churchill's role in suppressing the Monmouth Rebellion in 1685 helped secure the throne for James II, and for this service he was granted the title Earl of Marlborough. He also exhibited considerable diplomatic and political acumen. Winston's father, Randolph, himself held significant political influence in Britain in the late 19th century, but his advancement within the Conservative Party was hindered by his opposition to Lord Salisbury, who dominated the Conservatives in the 1880s and 1890s. Winston's mother, Jenny, was American, the daughter of a New York financier and businessman, Leonard Jerome. Her marriage to Randolph in April 1874, just over 6 months before Winston's birth, followed a brief courtship. This union was one of several high-profile marriages between members of the British aristocracy and the daughters of newly wealthy American businessmen during America's period of immense economic transformation, often referred to as the Gilded Age. These alliances typically provided the British noble family with a financial infusion to bolster their dwindling fortunes, while the American family gained social prestige by aligning with England's old aristocracy. Regardless, the marriage was never happy, and Jenny engaged in a series of affairs over the next 2 decades. For his part, Winston's father reportedly suffered from syphilis and ultimately died at the age of 45 in 1895. Despite their marital problems, Randolph and Jenny had a second child, Winston's younger brother John, born in 1880. Winston's childhood was somewhat representative of the British upper class during the late Victorian era. He and John were primarily raised by a nanny named Elizabeth Everest in various residences at Blenheim, in London, and for a time in Ireland. Then part of the United Kingdom, where the Churchills relocated in the late 1870s when Winston's grandfather was appointed viceroy. In the early 1880s, he was sent to the prestigious St. George's School at Ascot in Berkshire. However, in stark contrast to his later literary career, he showed little academic aptitude in his youth, and his behavior frequently drew reprimands. Despite these challenges, in 1888 he narrowly passed the entrance examination and matriculated at Harrow School in London, an ancient educational institution with a history spanning over 4 centuries. Nevertheless, it was his father's desire that he gain military experience abroad at a time when the British Empire was at its zenith and rapidly expanding across parts of Africa. Consequently, he attempted the entrance examination for the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, Britain's premier military college, on multiple occasions. He was finally admitted in 1893, spending just over a year there acquiring his rank. By that time, his father had passed away, and Winston effectively became the head of the family at the young age of 18. He had little time to settle into this new role. Having graduated from Sandhurst in early 1895, Winston was immediately commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars. With the Hussars, he was soon dispatched across the Atlantic. A war of independence, one of many initiated on the island in the 19th century, was being waged in Cuba by the colonial population against Spanish rule. Spain was desperately trying to retain control of one of the last few remaining fragments of what had once been its vast colonial empire in the Americas. They would ultimately lose the war, with America providing aid to the Cubans and subsequently replacing the Spanish as the dominant imperial power. Churchill's presence in Cuba in late 1895 was to observe the conflict for the British government. He began his publishing career modestly by submitting reports on the military campaign for publication in the Daily Graphic, a weekly newspaper published in Britain in the late 19th century. A brief visit to his mother's native country, including a stay in New York City, followed. In autumn 1896, the Queen's Own Hussars were reassigned to Bombay, one of Britain's oldest colonial possessions in India, and then a major administrative and military center of the British Raj. He would spend the next 18 months there. This period in India is notable for his accompaniment of the Malaccan Field Force, commanded by Sir Bindon Blood. In 1897, this force moved north into the region around Peshawar, commencing a campaign to suppress the revolt of the Mohmunds. The Momons were a Pashtun tribe who, for 2 years in the late 1890s, offered significant resistance to British rule in what was then considered northwestern India, today part of Pakistan. Back in England in 1898, some of Churchill's political opinions began to crystallize as he tentatively engaged with political life for the first time. He initially favored the Liberal Party, but strongly opposed their willingness to grant home rule or self-governance to Ireland. However, he did not remain in England for long. Within weeks, he was preparing to depart for Africa, where Britain was pursuing an ambitious objective to control a continuous swath of territory extending from Egypt in the north down to South Africa. By the mid-1890s, this ambition had brought the British into conflict with the Mahdist Islamic forces, controlling much of the Sudan region. Churchill successfully secured a position in the expeditionary force dispatched to the region in 1898 under the command of General Horatio Herbert Kitchener. Upon his arrival in early autumn, he was also sending reports on the expedition back to the Morning Post in Britain. These dispatches detailed the events of the Battle of Omdurman, which Churchill witnessed firsthand. This engagement, fought on September 2, 1898, near Khartoum in Sudan, saw a combined British and Egyptian force of approximately 25,000 men inflict a decisive defeat upon a Sudanese army more than twice its size. This battle served as a classic illustration of how European armies, equipped with advanced machine guns and other weaponry, could overcome numerically superior but technologically and tactically inferior enemy forces. Interestingly, despite his later reputation as Britain's wartime leader, Churchill held mixed feelings about what he observed at Omdurman. Writing to his cousin, the Duke of Marlborough, just weeks later, he described the battle as a magnificent spectacle, but expressed overall revulsion at the barbarity of the campaign. He particularly noted the killing of wounded enemy combatants and a callous disregard for the welfare of the Egyptian and Sudanese soldiers, who formed the majority of the British expeditionary force. His assessment of Kitchener's tactical abilities was also critical. Churchill's literary endeavors were also expanding during these years. While in India, his reading habits had broadened significantly. He voraciously consumed everything from Plato to Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. A particularly notable influence on his later work, which he read at this time, was Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, a monumental work considered the preeminent piece of historical writing of the British Enlightenment. He had also increased his own writing output. In 1898, he completed his first book, The Story of the Malaccan Field Force, based on his experiences campaigning against the Momons in the northwestern British Raj. A fictional work titled Savrola, composed around the same time, proved to be his first and last attempt at writing a romance novel. In Africa, his writing shifted towards more political subjects, not only in his reportage for the Morning Post, but also in the composition of an account of the broader campaign. This work was eventually published in 1899 as The River War, an historical account of the reconquest of the Sudan, a book that examined not only the events Churchill personally witnessed, but also the background of the campaign in the mid-1890s. Following his return to Britain from the Sudan expedition, Churchill made it clear that he intended to enter politics and assume the role his father had held as something of an independent voice within the Conservative Party. He contested a by-election in the Oldham constituency in Lancashire in 1899, but narrowly lost to a candidate from the Liberal Party, the Conservatives' main political rival in the late 19th century. His failure to secure the Oldham seat left Churchill sufficiently free to head to British South Africa. Conflict with the Boer states, known as the Orange Free State in the South African Republic, or Transvaal, which had been established northeast of the British colony, seemed imminent. Tensions had been escalating for years between the Boers, descendants of Dutch, German, and French Huguenot settlers who had migrated to South Africa in the 17th and 18th centuries. These settlers had established their own colonies independent of Britain, only for vast gold and diamond deposits to be discovered nearby, prompting British efforts to annex the newly formed Boer states. However, Churchill did not witness this later phase of the conflict. After being among the first to enter Pretoria in summer 1900, he compiled his account of the war in a new book titled Ian Hamilton's March, named after one of Britain's leading military commanders in the war. Churchill then departed for home and another attempt at securing a parliamentary seat. The period of the Second Boer War also saw the emergence of Churchill's significant inclination for alcohol. At one point, he headed for the front lines in South Africa with 36 bottles of wine, 18 bottles of Scotch whiskey, and half a dozen bottles of vintage brandy included among his extensive luggage. This was not merely an instance of excessive provisioning. Churchill was a heavy drinker throughout his entire adult life. Years later in London, he established a routine commencing with 1 or 2 whiskey and sodas in the morning. Lunch was typically accompanied by a pint of either wine or champagne, sometimes followed by a brandy. This process was repeated at dinner, concluding with 1 or 2 brandies and sodas in the evening. Moreover, his consumption was highly structured, involving a gradual intake of alcohol at regular intervals throughout the day. Indeed, what is remarkable, as will become apparent, is that Churchill maintained the level of activity and accomplishment he did throughout his adult life while drinking at such a high level. Back in Britain, Conservative Prime Minister Lord Salisbury decided to call a snap general election for October 1900, hoping to capitalize on positive public sentiment regarding his government's handling of the Second Boer War. Churchill once again contested the Oldham seat, which he had narrowly missed securing in the by-election the previous year. This time he was victorious and entered Westminster for the first time at the age of 25. Incidentally, the 1900 election was also significant as it marked the first time the Labour Representation Committee fielded candidates in a British national election. They would do so again with much greater success in the future as the Labour Party, and would soon become Churchill's principal domestic political adversaries in Britain. All that was yet to come. In 1900, the Liberals remained the Conservatives' primary opponents, though they failed to regain control of Parliament in the election, and Salisbury formed a new Conservative administration. Churchill made an impression with his maiden speech in February 1901, in which he expressed some sympathy for the Boer cause in South Africa, and asserted that if he himself were a Boer, he hoped he would be fighting against the British in the field. This was the first of many controversial and nuanced positions he would adopt over his more than 50 years as a member of the British Parliament. From the outset of his parliamentary career, Churchill was noted for maintaining what were perceived as excessively friendly relations with many senior members of the Liberal Party, notably the former Home Secretary Herbert Asquith. Friendly acquaintances were one thing, but Churchill was also ideologically aligned with the Liberals on several key issues. A major political division between the Conservatives and Liberals around the turn of the century centered on economic policy. Conservatives favored protectionism, while Liberals were free traders who believed Britain could benefit from opening its vast markets to German, French, American, and Russian trade. Churchill tended to support the liberal viewpoint. He also held opinions opposing the leadership of the Conservative Party under Salisbury on matters such as military spending, the political resolution of the South African situation after the Boer War, and the Irish question, a persistent source of contention in UK politics that had divided parliamentarians at Westminster for decades. Recognizing that his views could impede any advancement within the prevailing Conservative Party, Churchill briefly considered forming his own party, which would blend elements of liberal and conservative policies. However, in 1904, having been informed by the Conservative Party that he would not be selected to contest his Oldham seat again in the next election, he switched allegiances and joined the Liberals. He would spend the subsequent 18 years as a Liberal MP. Churchill was profoundly impacted by events that unfolded in his personal life in the mid-1900s. During this period, he met and began courting Clementine Hosier, a daughter of Sir Henry Hosier, a member of the British gentry, and a relative of the Earl of Airlie on her mother's side. They married at St. Margaret's Church at Westminster Abbey in 1908. Clementine provided unwavering stability for Winston throughout their long lives together. Their marriage was not one of convenience or arranged for political purposes, but was based on genuine respect and affection. They soon moved into a house in Eccleston Square in Pimlico, London, where their first child, a daughter named Diana, was born in 1909. 4 more children followed. Randolph, named after his grandfather, was born in 1911, followed by Sarah in 1914. A third daughter, Marigold, was born in 1918. Tragically, she died of sepsis of the throat in 1921 before reaching her 3rd birthday, an event that caused Churchill profound distress for the remainder of his life. A year later, their final child, Mary, was born. The following year, the Churchills relocated to Kent, moving into a large country house at Chartwell, where Winston and Clementine would reside for the rest of their lives when not occupying one of the august buildings on Downing Street in London. In the 1906 general election, held in the early weeks of the year, The Liberal Party under Henry Campbell Bannerman achieved a landslide victory over the Conservatives. Churchill's former party had been deeply divided over the free trade issue, allowing the Liberals to capitalize and Campbell Bannerman to become Prime Minister. His tenure in office was brief, lasting only until 1908, as he suffered a series of heart attacks in 1907. His eventual resignation facilitated the succession of Churchill's long-standing ally, Herbert Asquith, as Prime Minister. Churchill was soon promoted to the position of President of the Board of Trade, with David Lloyd George, a Welsh politician and rising figure within the Liberal Party, becoming Chancellor of the Exchequer. As President of the Board of Trade, Churchill was responsible for overseeing a broad spectrum of matters related to industrial relations and negotiations with trade unions. This occurred during a period of militant labor strike actions, not only in Britain but across Europe and North America. Churchill's approach to these developments was quite progressive. He introduced a series of liberal reforms, such as the Mines 8 Hours Bill, which limited mine workers to a maximum of 8 hours per day, and the Labor Exchanges Bill, establishing hundreds of centers providing payments to those temporarily unemployed. These measures aimed to alleviate social tensions in Britain, reduce strike activity, and curb the rise of the newly formed Labour Party, which had won dozens of seats in the 1906 general election. In 1910, Churchill was promoted to the post of Home Secretary, one of the major offices of state. In this capacity, he was effectively in charge of domestic security, including policing, immigration, and border control. Churchill had publicly stated his opposition to this in the late 1890s. However, more than a decade later, he became more receptive to the idea, provided a majority of male voters in Britain were in favor. To that end, he proposed a national referendum on the matter, but no consensus was reached, and the suffrage issue persisted throughout the 1910s. In 1911, after Asquith's Liberals secured a second term, Churchill was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, effectively placing him in charge of the Royal Navy at a time when Britain's naval power was still globally paramount and the foundation of its vast empire. He would remain in that office for several years as Europe approached a catastrophic war. In the early 1910s, the primary challenge facing Asquith, Churchill, and the Liberal government appeared to be the resolution of the Irish question. For decades, the Irish political establishment had demanded devolved government in Dublin in the form of Home Rule. However, this was opposed by Unionists in Northern Ireland, determined to prevent any move away from British rule in the country. Churchill supported Home Rule, viewing the Unionist calls for Ireland's partition as unacceptable. However, just as the Home Rule issue seemed close to a successful resolution in 1913 and 1914, war abruptly disrupted everything. For years, tensions had been building between the major European powers over a wide range of issues, not least colonial rivalry in Africa and the volatile nationalism of the Balkans. Ultimately, it was the Balkans that provided the spark for war when the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serb nationalist on June 28, 1914. In the following weeks, a regional crisis escalated into a full-blown European war as Britain, France, and the Russian Empire went to war with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. This conflict would soon become known as the First World War as its theater of operations expanded globally. Churchill's role in the First World War is typically remembered for its missteps. Much of his work involved organizing massive troop movements across the English Channel in the initial weeks and months of the war, as the conflict's focus shifted to the trenches of northeastern France, where French and British forces faced off against the Germans. However, Churchill envisioned a more ambitious naval strategy. He believed pressure could be relieved on the Western Front by striking a blow against the Ottoman Empire. This would reduce the number of troops Britain's ally, Russia, needed to commit to the campaign against the Turks in the Caucasus, thus allowing Russia to concentrate more soldiers on the Eastern Front in Poland and Ukraine against the Germans. This, in turn, would compel the Germans to divert troops from France to Poland. Churchill's strategy to weaken the Ottomans centered on a major naval assault on the Gallipoli Straits, the entryway to the Bosphorus, the internationally significant waterway in Istanbul. If successful, it might even be possible to capture Istanbul and force the Ottomans out of the war entirely. He swiftly persuaded Asquith's cabinet, and in the spring, a large British expeditionary force, significantly comprising troops from Australia and New Zealand, was dispatched to Gallipoli. The Gallipoli campaign proved to be one of the most disastrous British strategic errors of the war. It would drag on for a year from spring 1915 to 1916, involving nearly 500,000 British, Anzac, Irish, French, and Indian troops. However, it quickly became a debacle as the expeditionary force landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula in an area where the Ottomans held superior strategic positions. After repelling the initial British assault on their positions, the Ottomans effectively besieged the British and their allied troops at Gallipoli. Months of attritional warfare ensued, during which the British expeditionary force suffered over 50,000 casualties, with 250,000 more wounded or otherwise incapacitated. This proved to be one of the greatest setbacks of Churchill's career. As the magnitude of the blunder became evident throughout 1915, it became clear that he had lost the confidence of the wartime cabinet in London. He was removed from his position as First Lord of the Admiralty as Asquith yielded to pressure from the Conservatives. As the various British parties formed a wartime coalition government, Churchill responded energetically to this change in his circumstances. He resolved to rejoin the military and spent time in 1916 leading a unit on the Western Front in France. Upon his return to the House of Commons months later, he possessed a newfound appreciation for the plight of the common soldier. He advocated for the issuance of steel helmets to all rank and file, a necessity Churchill had recognized after nearly being killed by a piece of shrapnel himself while in France. 1917 also brought a shift in his political fortunes. The Dardanelles Commission reported that Churchill was not directly responsible for the failures at Gallipoli. Furthermore, David Lloyd George replaced Asquith as Prime Minister, leading to Churchill's appointment as Minister of Munitions. In this capacity, he was primarily tasked with ensuring that the domestic economy operated efficiently to produce sufficient ammunition, artillery, and other explosives to sustain the war effort. Much of this work involved negotiating an end to strike actions as they occurred in British munitions factories. It was not a glamorous role, but it was effective. Britain and its allies, France, the United States, and Italy, ultimately prevailed in the war in November 1918 because their domestic economies proved more resilient in wartime compared to those of Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary. Although the Germans won significantly more battles than they lost during World War I, they experienced critical resource shortages domestically. This led to widespread social and political unrest, culminating in the country's collapse into turmoil in late autumn 1918, thereby ending the conflict. The conclusion of World War I did not usher in an era of peace in Europe. With civil wars erupting across much of the continent as old empires dissolved, the period between 1918 and 1923 was, in fact, bloodier than the 4 years of warfare that preceded it. Churchill spent the initial part of this period serving concurrently as Secretary of State for War and Secretary of State for Air in a government led by Prime Minister David Lloyd George. In these dual capacities, Churchill was tasked with overseeing significant aspects of the process of demobilizing millions of British and Allied troops. His stance toward the defeated nations was complex. While advocating for Britain and France to maintain a substantial military presence in Germany after the cessation of hostilities, he cautioned against imposing overly punitive terms in the peace negotiations, a departure from the views of many British and French statesmen of the time. He saw Germany as a potential ally against a larger emerging threat in the East, Russia, where the Bolshevik communists had seized power in a revolution in late autumn 1917. A brutal civil war ensued in Russia until the early 1920s, during which Britain dispatched its own expeditionary force to northern Russia to support the counter-revolutionaries. As Minister for War, Churchill was deeply involved in these efforts and consistently advocated for an anti-Soviet policy. Elsewhere, Churchill displayed a ruthless streak in the post-war era. Some evidence of this emerged in the Middle East, where Britain and France had jointly partitioned the former Ottoman Empire into mandates or occupied territories. Britain gained control of Iraq, a country that presented immediate governance challenges. The Kurdish population in the north of the country consistently opposed foreign rule, whether by the Ottomans or the British. A major insurgency had developed by 1920, and it was at this juncture that Churchill suggested the use of chemical weapons, stating his belief that it was reasonable to experiment with such weapons against uncivilized tribes. Ultimately, chemical weapons were not extensively used in Iraq and Kurdistan at that time. However, as numerous studies since have demonstrated, this was not due to moral reservations, but simply because it proved logistically challenging to implement. This specific episode does not reflect positively on Churchill in retrospect. Although there is no definitive proof that any chemical weapons were deployed, it should also be noted that chemical agents like mustard gas were widely used in the First World War, and their formal prohibition under international agreement did not occur until the 1925 Geneva Protocol. Furthermore, his attitudes towards Ireland in the early 1920s were problematic. Churchill had long been a moderate regarding Ireland, where the majority Roman Catholic population throughout the island desired independence from Britain. This aspiration was opposed by a unionist majority in the north who favored continued ties with Britain, along with elements within the British political establishment unwilling to relinquish control of the island. Churchill had openly condemned the unionist argument for partitioning Ireland and allowing the north to remain within the United Kingdom. Despite his support for the Black and Tans, Churchill recognized the necessity of a negotiated peace. Throughout 1921, he played a central role in the negotiations leading to the Anglo-Irish Treaty. This agreement granted independence to Ireland, excluding the Unionist North, within the framework of the community of nations known as the British Empire. In February 1921, Churchill was appointed Secretary of State for the Colonies, a significant governmental portfolio in the aftermath of the First World War. Britain's already extensive empire had expanded as a result of territories transferred from the Ottoman Empire in Germany's colonies to British and French control. His primary focus during this period was the Middle East, where many indigenous populations in the Levant and Arabian Peninsula had allied with Britain against the Ottomans during the war, but now felt betrayed, feeling they had merely exchanged one imperial ruler, the Turks, for another, Britain. This sentiment was particularly strong in Palestine, where the Palestinian population was concerned by the accelerating efforts of Jewish Zionists to establish a new Jewish state. Churchill held sympathies for the Jewish cause, but these were tempered following a week of rioting in early May 1921 in Jaffa, incited by the Jewish Communist Party. The riots resulted in dozens killed and hundreds wounded. The instigators' stated objective was to end British rule in the Levant and establish a Soviet Palestine, an aim that did little to improve Churchill's view of the Jewish cause in Palestine. Ultimately, his tenure as Secretary of State for Colonies was brief. In autumn 1922, a crisis emerged regarding the British policing of the Dardanelles neutral zone near Gallipoli, the site of Churchill's inglorious defeat as First Lord of the Admiralty years prior. This shift in the British political landscape prompted Churchill to reassess his own political affiliations. The Liberals demonstrated a willingness to offer tacit support to the Labour Party on a conditional basis. For Churchill, who viewed the prospect of the Labour Party aligning Britain with Soviet Russia with extreme concern, the nation's political map had been fundamentally redrawn. British politics, he believed, was now a struggle between the Conservatives and the Labour Party, with the Liberals increasingly relegated to a minor third party. Unsurprisingly, by 1924, even before a new election was called, Churchill had effectively rejoined the Conservatives, 2 decades after his defection to the Liberals. As a strategic political move, Churchill's return was well-timed. A new general election took place on October 29, 1924, the third in 2 years following the collapse of the minority Labour government. Churchill secured a new seat representing the constituency of Epping, and the Conservatives, led by Stanley Baldwin, won a substantial parliamentary majority. Days after officially rejoining the Conservatives, Churchill was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer. He would oversee Britain's finances for nearly 5 years until summer 1929. His tenure in this position, second only to Prime Minister in importance within the British political system, is most notable for his decision to reinstate the gold standard. This policy linked the pound sterling, Britain's currency, to the nation's gold reserves and the global gold price. This system had been the norm for Western nations for centuries, but was temporarily abandoned by Britain with the onset of war in 1914. Churchill's decision to re-establish the gold standard is considered to have had both positive and negative consequences. On one hand, it led to a significant period of deflation, which was much needed following the vast levels of state expenditure incurred during and after the war. However, conversely, it is now understood to have contributed to considerable job losses and unemployment across Britain, particularly in coal and steel industries, which had formed the backbone of industrial Britain for 150 years. A new general election was called in Britain in summer 1929, as Baldwin's government approached the end of its term. The Conservatives lost power to the Labour Party, whose time in office lasted only 2 years before a national government was formed in 1931 in response to the crisis triggered by the 1929 Wall Street financial crash and the ensuing Great Depression. However, with Labour, the Conservatives, the Liberals, and other groups like the Liberal Nationals all participating in the cabinet, along with several independent technocrats, there was no place in government for Churchill, who had continued to hold his seat for the Epping constituency throughout these years. This exclusion from the center of power would persist for most of the 1930s, as Churchill was again overlooked for a position in Baldwin's cabinet when the Conservatives returned to power on their own in the mid-1930s. Consequently, the period from his departure from the Chancellor of the Exchequer office in 1929 until the late 1930s, when he would experience a remarkable return to political prominence, is generally known as the wilderness years of Churchill's political career. Scholars have suggested that Churchill may have suffered from depression, which he termed his black dog. This, alongside his drinking, was reportedly exacerbated during these years. However, this is not to suggest that Churchill was inactive during the 1930s. Far from it. In some respects, these years were incredibly productive, particularly regarding his writing. Churchill wrote consistently throughout his adult life, having cultivated the habit during his time in India, in Africa in the late 1890s. For example, in the early 1920s, he commenced work on what became a 6-volume study of the events leading up to, during, and following the First World War, published as The World Crisis. Upon completing this work with the publication of the final volume in 1931, he embarked on arguably his most significant literary project, a 4-volume study of the life and times of his ancestor John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough. While Churchill conceived it as an unvarnished tribute to Marlborough and his accomplishments, the study, spanning 4 substantial volumes, each approximately 200,000 words, was well received. It provided not only an account of John Churchill's life, but also examined British and European politics during the era of King Louis XIV of France in the War of the Spanish Succession. The American political philosopher Leo Strauss considered it the preeminent historical work written in the 20th century. Today, it reads more compellingly than most other works of historical prose from the first half of the 20th century. Above all, it effectively captures Marlborough's significance as a political and military figure. His victory over the French at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704 was a decisive moment in Britain's efforts to check French expansion under Louis XIV. It paved the way for Britain to gradually surpass France as the leading European power throughout the 18th century. Churchill's text conveys the magnitude of these events with a clarity rare in other works on Marlborough and his era. Beyond his literary pursuits and back in Parliament, Churchill was a fervent advocate regarding another outcome of Britain's 18th century expansion, the status of India. For years, debate had raged concerning the future of the British Raj, or Crown Rule, with calls for independence becoming increasingly difficult to ignore by the 1930s. 3 potential options appeared to exist: some form of devolved government, becoming a dominion like Australia and New Zealand, or perhaps complete independence. In the early 1930s, both Labour and the Conservatives largely concurred on the idea that India should be granted dominion status, a legal position that would effectively provide India with self-governance on a wide range of internal matters while maintaining its nominal jurisdiction under the British Empire. Crucially, London would retain control over India's foreign policy and military affairs. However, this arrangement was anathema to Churchill. As he aged, his political ideology became increasingly staunchly imperialist and monarchical. He harbored particular disdain for Mahatma Gandhi, the principal Indian independence leader, and the Indian National Congress he led. This sentiment was partly rooted in Churchill's perception of many subject populations as less developed than the British. In his view, India was not socially, culturally, or politically prepared for self-governance. He consistently argued throughout the 1930s that, quote, "If India could look after herself, we would be delighted." Unsurprisingly, when the India Bill came before Parliament in December 1934, proposing significant self-governance for India, he voted against the act, though it ultimately passed. Churchill's vocal opposition to Indian self-government, and particularly his criticisms of Gandhi's character, may well have influenced matters closer to home. In the early 1930s, Churchill also began sounding the alarm concerning the rise to power of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in Germany. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in the first weeks of 1933, and the Nazis quickly transformed the country into a one-party state. As early as April 1933, Churchill delivered a speech in the British House of Commons in which he spoke about what he called the odious conditions in Germany. As the months passed and the Nazis began rearming Germany in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Churchill lambasted government policy for failing to recognize the threat posed by a revitalized German military. He was particularly critical of the failure to develop a new, modern, and well-equipped British Air Force in the speed with which the German Luftwaffe surpassed the British RAF from 1935 onwards. Yet Churchill's warnings were dismissed in some circles. This was partly because he had lost credibility among a significant number of MPs due to his vehement objections to Indian self-government and his scathing attacks on Gandhi's character. Perhaps many wondered Churchill's critique of Hitler and the Nazis was similarly ill-founded. Churchill would persist in warning the British political establishment about the Nazi dangers into the mid-1930s and beyond. Despite his efforts, many failed to recognize the threat. This should perhaps be viewed within its historical context. The 1930s was a period of extremist politics. Italy had been under the control of Benito Mussolini and his fascists since the early 1920s, and Spain would soon be gripped by a brutal civil war. For many within Britain's political sphere, Hitler and the Nazis were not perceived as the primary threat within this landscape. Instead, the greater danger seemed to emanate from the Soviet Union and its authoritarian leader, Joseph Stalin. The fear was that if Moscow-aligned communist movements emerged and seized power in a number of Central and Western European nations, Russia would soon be in a position to dominate the continent. Viewed from this perspective, the Nazis were considered the lesser of two evils, and indeed, a bulwark against the rise of radical socialism. Notably, in 1936, Churchill's old ally in government during World War I, David Lloyd George, visited Germany, met Hitler, and reported back enthusiastically on German efforts to rebuild the country following the Great Depression's impact. It was for these reasons that many individuals either failed to perceive the Nazi threat as Churchill did in the 1930s, or deliberately chose to ignore it. This was not due to a lack of effort on the part of the former Chancellor of the Exchequer. In an attempt to raise awareness, he even aligned himself in the mid-1930s with the Anti-Nazi Council, a British political organization originating from the left-wing movement in England. In order to collaborate with them, Churchill moderated his critical stance towards the Soviet Union. Within the council, a dedicated focus group emerged, composed of fierce opponents of the Nazis and the British form of fascism, led by Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. This group included figures such as Austen Chamberlain, half-brother of Neville Chamberlain, who succeeded Stanley Baldwin as conservative leader and became prime minister in 1937, and other conservative politicians like Robert Boothby and Henry Page Croft. Collectively, they organized rallies and meetings aimed at highlighting the risks of appeasing Germany. Simultaneously, they collaborated with civil service and intelligence personnel to compile concrete evidence detailing the extent of Germany's rearmament program. Despite these mid-1930s efforts, Churchill's and his allies' message seemed to be largely disregarded. Several factors diverted attention within British politics. Not least was the crisis following King Edward VIII's succession to the throne in January 1936. Edward was determined to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee whose status was socially unacceptable by 1930s British norms. A constitutional crisis ensued, resolved only at year's end with Edward's abdication in favor of his younger brother, who became King George II. The consequence of the abdication crisis was that the issues of German rearmament and the increasingly aggressive posture of Hitler and the Nazis towards their neighbors were largely sidelined throughout 1936. Furthermore, unknown to the political establishment, another setback occurred in early summer 1937 when Stanley Baldwin retired from politics. He was succeeded as Prime Minister by Neville Chamberlain. Over the subsequent 18 months, Chamberlain would implement what is, in hindsight, one of the most profoundly misguided policies of appeasement in human history. Churchill would serve as his most outspoken critic throughout this period. At the core of the issue in the late 1930s was the accelerating pace at which Nazi Germany sought to fulfill its ambitions. Hitler and the Nazis' objective had always been to strengthen Germany's economy, rearm the nation, and initiate a new pan-European war to exact revenge for the humiliation imposed upon the German people at the end of World War I. Initially, Hitler and his Confederates believed they needed to wait until 1941 or 1942 before launching such a conflict. However, by 1938, observing the apparent indifference of the British and French political establishments to German rearmament, Hitler decided to expedite the process. Thus, in March 1938, diplomatic and military pressure was exerted on Austria to force the country into a political union with Germany. When Greater Germany was proclaimed and Nazi flags were raised in Vienna, Churchill delivered a speech to the House of Commons in England, declaring that the gravity of the situation could not be underestimated. Nevertheless, few were willing to accept his warnings at face value. Following Austria's annexation, Hitler immediately demanded control of the Sudetenland, a large area of western Czechoslovakia predominantly inhabited by ethnic Germans. By autumn 1938, the German military was preparing for an invasion of Czechoslovakia if the European powers did not capitulate to Germany's demands. Churchill was resolute that Britain could not tolerate this and visited Neville Chamberlain at 10 Downing Street, the official residence of the British Prime Minister, to formally register his conviction that Britain should declare war on Germany if the Nazis violated Czechoslovakian sovereignty. At minimum, he argued for a firm stance in negotiations with Hitler. However, Chamberlain disregarded his advice. Instead, just days later, he flew to Munich in southern Germany for a conference with Hitler and other major heads of state. There, on September 30, 1938, Chamberlain became a signatory to the Munich Agreement, a diplomatic arrangement that ceded the Sudetenland to the Nazis in exchange for a promise that Berlin would make no further territorial claims. Back in England, Churchill was appalled as the policy of appeasement reached its zenith. He described Munich as a total and unmitigated defeat. Events soon proved Churchill correct and Chamberlain wrong. In March 1939, Hitler and the Nazis violated the terms of the Munich Agreement by dismembering the rest of Czechoslovakia, annexing parts, and creating a satellite state from the remainder. Within days, Berlin signaled that Poland was its next target. With war now seemingly unavoidable in the near future, Britain and France belatedly accelerated their rearmament programs. Meanwhile, back in England, Churchill's political standing grew as members of Parliament and the general public came to acknowledge the prescience of the warnings he had issued since 1933 regarding the Nazis. Consequently, there was increasing pressure for Chamberlain to include Churchill in the government. Chamberlain eventually consented, but not before the Second World War began. The conflict's outbreak was triggered by Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany in response. That same day, Chamberlain appointed Churchill as the new First Lord of the Admiralty, the position he had held 25 years earlier and vacated ignominiously after the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. This marked the beginning of his rapid ascent to becoming Britain's wartime leader. Uncertain how to proceed, British strategists turned their attention to Norway's strategic position, controlling a significant portion of northern Europe's coastline and the North Atlantic. The country was neutral, but many suspected Hitler and the Nazis might move in the spring to occupy Norway, and possibly Sweden, to gain control of North Atlantic seaports and secure Sweden's vast iron ore reserves, crucial for the German war effort in the long run. Consequently, throughout winter 1939 and spring 1940, Churchill and the Admiralty Office developed strategic plans to either lay sea mines along the Norwegian coastline or occupy key Norwegian ports like Narvik. Measures were being implemented to realize these plans in spring 1940, when the Nazis abruptly ended the relative calm by invading Denmark and seizing control of Norway through special operations involving the airlift of thousands of German paratroopers into Norway's major cities and ports. In response to Germany's occupation of Norway, a combined expeditionary force comprising British, French, Free Polish, and Free Norwegian troops was dispatched to the North Atlantic in April 1940. This force achieved limited success, a situation that sparked the infamous Norway debate in the British House of Commons on May 7th. The nominal purpose of the debated motions was the handling of this specific campaign, but the discussion quickly broadened to encompass the overall conduct of the war by Neville Chamberlain and his government. Over 3 days of debate, it became evident that Chamberlain had not only lost the support of the Labour and Liberal parties, but also a substantial portion of the Conservative Party. A former wartime leader, David Lloyd George. This was a clear indication that Churchill, unlike Chamberlain, was prepared to accept accountability for his actions and the management of affairs. When Chamberlain resigned as prime minister following the debate's conclusion on May 9th, Churchill was quickly appointed as the new prime minister on May 10th. He later reflected that his entire life up to this point had been, quote, a preparation for this hour and for this trial. Churchill had no time to acclimate to his new position. In the early hours of May 10th, the very day he became prime minister, the Germans invaded Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Churchill began assembling a cabinet based on cross-party participation, effectively forming a government of national unity. Then on May 13, 1940, he delivered his first address to the House of Commons, famously declaring, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." This was the first of 3 speeches he would deliver in summer 1940, widely credited with galvanizing the nation's resolve to continue fighting the Nazis. Churchill's determination was crucial, as a significant segment of Parliament in summer 1940 believed Britain should negotiate peace terms with the Nazis. This sentiment intensified after Germany swiftly occupied the Low Countries and advanced on Paris within weeks of the May 1940 invasion. By the end of the month, the British expeditionary force of approximately 300,000 men was trapped in the French port city of Dunkirk. Only the renowned naval rescue mission, conducted by thousands of small British fishing and merchant vessels, managed to salvage a degree of success from the jaws of defeat. Upon the troops' return to southern England, Churchill delivered the second of his famous speeches declaring, "We shall never surrender." Churchill needed to rally the nation and Parliament. The rapid German conquest of France in early summer 1940 had left many in Britain disheartened. Believing a German invasion of Britain was imminent, the nation now stood largely alone against the Nazis, and many, including senior members of Churchill's own party, believed they should negotiate with the Nazis to secure the best possible peace terms. It was in this critical juncture that Churchill made perhaps his greatest contribution to history. Through his speeches and actions, he convinced Parliament and the nation that the fight must continue. In his third speech, he unequivocally stated of the government, quote, "Our inflexible resolve to continue the war." This unwavering spirit ensured Britain endured the dark days of 1940. Consequently, in subsequent years, the Allies were positioned to open a Western front in France. This was not as easily achieved as is often suggested. Throughout the initial months of his premiership, Churchill faced the unenviable task of persuading senior cabinet members, such as Lord Halifax, that Britain must persevere and not seek peace terms from Hitler. He ultimately won this crucial argument. As the Germans initiated a naval blockade and bombing campaign against Britain from late summer 1940 onwards, the British people braced themselves for the prolonged struggle ahead. The war over the subsequent 18 months was turbulent. Churchill effectively served as the sole leader of resistance against the Nazis for a significant portion of this period. The Blitz, short for Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war, referring to the German bombing campaign against Britain, continued through winter 1940 and into 1941. During this time, Churchill desperately sought assistance from U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt personally favored intervention against the Nazis, but American public opinion opposed involvement in what was considered a European conflict. However, he negotiated the Lend-Lease program with Churchill, which took effect in March 1941. This program allowed the U.S. to provide Britain with extensive support in the form of food, oil, and war materials while ostensibly maintaining neutrality. This was a significant breakthrough for Churchill's government and was soon followed by another fortunate development. Hitler decided to largely halt the Blitz and instead shift focus eastward to invade the Soviet Union. In summer 1941, the Nazis launched the largest land invasion in human history, with 3 million men invading the Soviet Union. The initial phase was successful, with German forces advancing to the outskirts of Moscow and Leningrad by October and November 1941. However, the advance stalled during that winter. In December 1941, the strategic situation shifted further when Germany's ally, the Empire of Japan, launched an unprovoked attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This brought the United States into the war. Churchill now became the leader of one of 3 major nations: Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union, whose combined strength could be brought to bear against the Nazis. In 1942, the European war primarily centered on the conflict between German and Russian forces on the Eastern Front. However, Japan's entry into the war created an entirely new theater of operations for Britain in southern Asia. In addition to attacking Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Japanese began advancing on Britain's colonies in southern Asia, particularly towards Singapore and into British Burma. Singapore fell to the Japanese on February 15, 1942. Churchill's government had made a strategic error by concentrating on the city's naval defense, believing the land connection to Singapore from Malaysia was impassable for the Japanese army, a belief that proved entirely incorrect. Churchill stated in the aftermath of the garrison's surrender that it was the worst defeat the country had suffered in British military history. Subsequently, the Japanese pressed further westward. Much of the fighting between British and Japanese forces in 1942 and 1943 focused on Burma and the region encompassing present-day Bangladesh. Throughout this period, Calcutta was even regularly bombed by the Japanese, indicating the extent of Japanese penetration into the British Raj. The Japanese advance was eventually checked on India's northeastern frontier and gradually pushed back during 1943. However, the necessity of Indian support had allowed Gandhi to exert significant pressure on the British government through what became known as the Quit India Campaign. This movement called for an orderly British withdrawal from India after the war in exchange for India's support during the conflict. In 1943, a horrific famine afflicted Bengal, resulting in the deaths of between 2 and 4 million people. The exact number is unknown. Millions more suffered from malnutrition and displacement. While wartime famines are not uncommon, the Bengal famine of 1943 is largely understood today as having been primarily man-made. The famine occurred after the Japanese occupied Burma in 1942, cutting off rice imports to the eastern subcontinent. Churchill and his war cabinet, fearing a full-scale Japanese invasion of India, ordered a scorched earth policy in the region in response to the threat, resulting in the seizure or destruction of thousands of acres of farmland. Churchill's government also implemented policies in 1941 and 1942, including mass conscription of farm laborers. This, combined with a series of natural disasters in 1942, including a cyclone in the Bay of Bengal, further exacerbated the widespread starvation and famine, culminating in the deaths of up to 3 million people in the region. Although some figures are higher, Churchill has been widely blamed for perpetuating and even instigating this famine by Indian and progressive historians in recent publications, as his disregard for the country and its independence-seeking population was by this time well known. However, Churchill's defenders argue that, upon becoming fully aware of the famine's scale on September 24, 1943, he and his war cabinet diverted 250,000 tons of grain to India. They also point to the Japanese invasion of Burma as a primary cause of the crisis, alongside wartime shipping shortages, inadequate local governance, misallocated food resources, and natural disasters. In Churchill's defense, the British government's attention was indeed focused elsewhere in 1942 and 1943, primarily North Africa, where Italian and German forces sought to overrun the British position in Egypt, thereby seizing the Suez Canal and access to Middle Eastern oil fields. Consequently, what might otherwise have been a limited regional conflict over a stretch of the Sahara Desert acquired greater significance in 1942. The tide turned with a major British victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein in early November. This, combined with the impending Soviet victory at the Battle of Stalingrad in southern Russia, led Churchill to declare in a speech delivered in London on November 10, 1942, that this is perhaps the end of the beginning. He was correct. In the first half of 1943, the war decisively shifted against the Nazis and in favor of the Allies. By late spring, British, French, and American forces were victorious in North Africa, while the Russians had begun pushing the Germans back towards Poland and Ukraine. That summer, a long-anticipated second front in Europe was opened when the Western Allies invaded Sicily and then Italy. He had developed this habit in his younger years and claimed it enhanced his productivity in the evenings. After the nap, he would have dinner, more drinks, and several more hours of work, often continuing past midnight in his study. This pattern was frequently interrupted by sudden events and travel requirements outside London, but the Prime Minister's working style generally followed these lines when possible. Extraordinary events that compelled Churchill to deviate from this routine became more frequent in 1944. In the first half of the year, the Western Allies began preparing to open a major Western front against the Nazis by invading France from Britain. This endeavor marked the culmination of Churchill's success in keeping Britain in the war in 1940. Undertaking such an operation across the entire Atlantic Ocean would have been nearly impossible for the United States alone, but it was entirely feasible from Britain. Churchill played a central role in planning what became the D-Day landings. He was unusually anxious throughout this period, fearing the landings could result in an Allied bloodbath if poorly planned or if German intelligence obtained information about the proposed landing sites in northern France. Meanwhile, throughout 1943 and 1944, Churchill also traveled abroad on several occasions to attend summits of the main Allied leaders. At Casablanca in January 1943, Tehran in the final weeks of the year, Quebec in Canada in September 1944, Moscow a month later, and finally Yalta in Crimea in February 1945. These summits, featuring Churchill, U.S. President Roosevelt, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin as the dominant figures, were the primary venues where the post-war world order was effectively shaped. Each leader had specific concerns during these conferences. Roosevelt, for example, was primarily focused on the issue of defeating Japan once the war in Europe concluded. For his part, Churchill's main interest lay in Eastern and Southern Europe, and the degree to which countries like Greece, Poland, and the various Balkan nations would fall under either Western or Soviet influence in the post-war settlement. He clashed with Stalin on this matter, and even before the war ended in Europe, the seeds of the Cold War were firmly planted at Yalta. The final months of the war saw one of the most controversial actions undertaken by the Western Allies throughout the entire conflict. In spring 1945, as they prepared for the final push on Berlin, the Allies conducted a massive bombing campaign against Germany's major cities. Churchill was a strong proponent of what was known as the Area Bombing Directive. This policy had been first issued in 1942 with the aim of having the British Royal Air Force systematically bomb Germany's industrial cities to cripple its domestic economy and war machine. However, in spring 1945, this took on a character that has retrospectively been deemed more retaliatory than strategic. The most infamous incident occurred in mid-February 1945 when Naval 300 bomber aircraft dropped nearly 4,000 tons of explosives on Dresden in less than 72 hours. Approximately 25,000 people were killed, and the city was reduced to a smoldering ruin by the Allied bombing campaign. Churchill has been criticized for strongly advocating this policy, whose strategic validity was highly questionable. Nevertheless, compared to the actions of the Russians as they advanced through Poland and Eastern Germany, the Allied offensive in Western Germany was significantly more humane. Furthermore, there were genuine concerns in spring 1945 that without a swift victory, a guerrilla war could erupt in Germany, potentially lasting years. Some felt at the time that extensive area bombing was justified if it would bring the war to a quicker conclusion. Ultimately, no such guerrilla warfare materialized. With the opening of the Western Front in Europe in summer 1944, the Nazi war effort began to crumble. Hitler desperately divided his forces among the three active fronts. By early 1945, despite a German counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest in December 1944, Allied forces were entering Germany from both the west and the east. By this time, Churchill's focus had shifted to establishing a new United Nations, an international body intended to replace the Interwar League of Nations and hopefully prove more effective in the complex issue of the status of countries like Poland and Hungary in the post-war settlement. These matters were still under debate as Russian forces encircled Berlin in late spring and commenced the final siege of the city. The Western Allies simultaneously spread across Western and Southern Germany, eliminating remaining resistance in hopes of bringing the war to a swift conclusion. This outcome was achieved. Hitler committed suicide in Berlin on April 30, 1945, and just over a week later, German forces surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The war in the Pacific continued for 4 months, but with America's deployment of 2 nuclear weapons on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the fighting abruptly ceased. The Second World War was over. With the war concluded, Churchill promptly called a general election in Britain, held on July 5, 1945. Churchill might have anticipated a landslide victory for the Conservatives immediately following the war, given the widespread popularity and perceived effectiveness of his wartime leadership. However, this was not to be. In 1942, a British civil servant and academic named William Beveridge had authored a report proposing a framework for restructuring British society in the post-war period. The aim was to prevent the emergence of social and political extremism in Britain, which had ravaged the continent in the 1930s and contributed to the war. He outlined a comprehensive plan for a national insurance system where British citizens would contribute to a common fund to provide services such as a national health service, unemployment benefits, sickness payments for those unable to work, and various other social provisions. Out of office, Churchill devoted himself to cautioning against the threat posed by the Soviet Union. Despite agreements reached at summits like Tehran and Yalta in the final years of the conflict, the conclusion of World War II in Europe effectively saw the Soviet Union and the Western Allies imposing control over whichever territories their forces occupied in the war's final year. Consequently, despite prior agreements to the contrary, Poland and Hungary were rapidly absorbed into the Soviet bloc, with communist regimes imposed. In the Balkans, the partisan leader Josip Tito, who had spearheaded much of the resistance against Nazi occupation during the war, established the new state of Yugoslavia along communist lines, although he would soon diverge from Moscow's oversight. However, the United States, Britain, and other Western allies successfully kept Greece and Turkey within their sphere of influence in the mid-1940s, largely through substantial financial aid provided by the administration of the new U.S. President, Harry Truman. Austria remained a point of contention, with Soviet, British, and American troops stationed there for a decade after the war. For a period, there was a genuine risk that the country would be divided into pro-Soviet and pro-Western blocs, similar to the eventual division of Germany. Churchill was among the first statesmen to fully comprehend the significance of these developments in Europe and the broader shift in global power balance between the Soviet Union and the United States. During a 3-month tour of the U.S. in early 1946, he delivered a famous speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, addressing the escalating Cold War between the Soviet Union and the Western world, led by the U.S. Here he famously declared, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." In this new environment, Churchill called for increasing cooperation among Western states to prevent further Soviet expansion, specifically noting the special relationship between the U.S. and Britain founded on their shared language and cultural heritage. His understanding of Europe's new political configuration found formal expression in subsequent years. The Soviet Union organized Eastern Europe into the Warsaw Pact, while Western allies coalesced into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, as it is more commonly known. Furthermore, while Churchill was not the first to use the term Iron Curtain in reference to Soviet dominance in Europe, the phrase having been used by Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels in the war's final months, he popularized it and integrated it into broader Cold War terminology. Despite being out of power in Britain in the latter half of the 1940s, Churchill continued to play a significant role in British politics as leader of the opposition. He maintained his opposition to India's independence, although it was granted in 1947. He accurately predicted that independence would lead to bitter divisions along religious and social lines, and that a rapid, disorderly creation of an independent Indian state would result in problems. His views on the Republic of Ireland were forward-thinking. He strongly opposed the partition of the island and advocated for the North to join the Republic, provided it happened peacefully. Had his counsel been heeded, the bitter civil conflict that erupted in Northern Ireland in the 1960s and lasted for 30 years might have been averted. In a 1947 address at the University of Zurich, Churchill urged Europeans to move past the horrors of the past and forge a European family based on justice, compassion, and liberty, even proposing the creation of a United States of Europe. He was an early proponent of British membership in the European Coal and Steel Community, proposed in 1950 and established in 1951 to promote free trade among France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. It would ultimately take over 2 decades for Britain to recognize its significant economic lag behind its Western European neighbors before joining what was then the European Economic Community. Churchill experienced a political resurgence, a kind of Indian summer. Despite failing to defeat the Labour Party in the 1950 general election, Churchill retained the Conservative Party's confidence as their leader. Moreover, Labour had secured only a narrow majority of 5 seats in the election, prompting their leader, Clement Attlee, to call a new snap election in 1951, hoping for a larger majority. His calculation proved incorrect. Instead, the Conservatives increased their seat count by 23, providing Churchill with a workable majority to form a new government. Thus, over 6 years after leaving the post, Churchill returned as Prime Minister, just shy of his 77th birthday. He primarily focused on foreign affairs, for a time also holding the portfolio of Minister for Defense. On the domestic front, The main concerns were housing construction and the normalization of society as wartime measures like rationing, which continued until the late 1940s, were phased out. Churchill was aided in these efforts by his eventual successor, Harold Macmillan, who served as Minister for Housing and Local Government. In addition, he published numerous single-volume historical works on various subjects and several memoirs detailing his travels through Africa. Dozens of volumes of his speeches were also compiled over the years, edited to some extent by his son Randolph. Churchill was unable to attend the ceremony in Stockholm to personally accept the award in 1953, but he was particularly proud of receiving it for his literary achievements, independent of his political career. He continued writing thereafter, and his 4-volume A History of the English-Speaking Peoples, published between 1956 and 1958, is generally regarded as one of his most accomplished historical studies, still well-respected today. Ultimately, Churchill would not be able to complete his term as Prime Minister. By the time he entered 10 Downing Street in early winter 1951, his health was in decline. It was unofficially understood by a wide circle of senior conservative politicians that he would serve for only a year or two before transferring leadership to his designated successor, Anthony Eden. However, Eden faced his own health challenges, and Churchill was noticeably reluctant to relinquish power as 1952 turned into 1953. Ultimately, however, his own deteriorating health made the decision for him. In June 1953, Churchill suffered a stroke that caused temporary paralysis on one side of his body. He was forced to recuperate at his Chartwell home for the next 6 months, but declined to resign as Prime Minister. Details of his declining health were withheld from the British public. Although he recovered significantly in 1954, he accepted the inevitable in 1955 and resigned as Prime Minister in April of that year. At that time, he was granted a knighthood, declining the higher honor of becoming Duke of London, which Queen Elizabeth II had offered him. Despite being 80 years old, he did not fully retire, continuing to hold a seat in Parliament until the 1960s. There he was recognized as Father of the House, the honorary title bestowed at Westminster on the longest-serving member of the House of Commons. In semi-retirement, Churchill played a limited role in frontline politics, spending much of his time at Chartwell in Kent and reducing his participation in the House of Commons. Nevertheless, he continued to offer private commentary on major political events. He was scathing in his criticism of his successor, Eden's handling of the 1956 Suez Crisis. This crisis followed Egyptian President Gamal Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal, in which Britain held a significant stake. During the crisis, Israel, Britain, and France jointly invaded Egypt, but were compelled to withdraw under pressure from the Soviet Union, the US, and the United Nations. Churchill also lamented the diminishing British Empire as it began granting independence to numerous states from the late 1950s onwards. Privately, he dedicated much of his later years to completing some of his written works and painting at Chartwell, while he and his wife Clementine also traveled when possible, spending time along the French Riviera and in the United States. Churchill began experiencing a series of increasing health problems in the early 1960s. For instance, while vacationing in Monte Carlo in 1962, he fell and broke his hip. An awareness of his approaching death prompted President John F. Kennedy to proclaim Churchill an honorary American citizen in 1963. The following summer, the House of Commons in the UK passed a special resolution thanking Churchill for his years of service as he chose not to seek re-election as an MP. By that time, he had served in Parliament for 64 years, only losing his seat for a brief 2-year period in the early 1920s. He suffered another stroke on January 10, 1965, and died 2 weeks later on January 24th at the age of 90. In recognition of his extensive career, wartime leadership, and significant public service, Churchill was granted a state funeral, the first time an individual who was not a member of the royal family had received this honor in Britain since 1898, when another former Prime Minister, William Gladstone, was given a state funeral. His coffin lay in state at Westminster for 3 days before the funeral service was held at St. Paul's Cathedral in central London. The ceremony was unusual for a former Prime Minister in that it was attended by Queen Elizabeth II. Afterward, Churchill's body was transported by boat down the River Thames and sent to Oxfordshire, where he was buried near his family's ancestral home at Blenheim Palace. Some months later, a memorial stone was placed near the tomb of the unknown warrior at Westminster to commemorate Churchill's death, coinciding with the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, during which Churchill led resistance against Nazi Germany. During World War I, he briefly commanded the Royal Navy and was controversially responsible for initiating the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. Given his colorful, broader life, one might overlook that Churchill also managed the British economy as Chancellor of the Exchequer for much of the 1920s. Furthermore, many familiar with his famous speeches delivered in summer 1940 are completely unaware of Churchill's extensive literary output and historical works, for which he received the Nobel Prize in 1953. Finally, in World War II's aftermath, he played a major role in Britain's post-war reconstruction and the Cold War's inception. However, while no serious assessment of Churchill's life can dispute his significance to 20th century history, there is less consensus regarding his legacy. Churchill was undeniably a staunch imperialist, and his views in this regard can be seen as placing him on the wrong side of history concerning issues such as the use of paramilitary forces in Ireland during the War of Independence, the proposed use of chemical weapons in the Middle East in the early 1920s, and his attitudes towards the Indian independence movement. Some also argue that Churchill was a warmonger who prioritized personal ambition over national needs, while others contend he was responsible for war crimes in India, particularly concerning the Bengal famine. These issues stand against Churchill's reputation, but there is also much to commend him historically. On many issues, his views were surprisingly modern, notably his advocacy of free trade, his eventual support for the suffragist movement, and his desire for Ireland not to be partitioned between a Republican South and a Unionist North. He was absolutely correct in his perception of the threats posed by Hitler's rise in the 1930s and the impending Cold War in 1945. Other aspects of his legacy are often completely overlooked, including his abilities as a historian and writer. Also notable is his call for conciliatory treatment of both the Boers and the Germans following the Second Boer War and World War I, respectively. However, his role as Britain's wartime leader during the dire circumstances of 1940 is unquestionably his greatest legacy. Had Churchill not persuaded Parliament and the nation in 1940 that Britain must continue the fight against Germany, the map of Europe in the latter half of the 20th century would have been drastically different. Without the Western Allies advancing from Britain into France and Western Germany, the Soviets would most likely have occupied the rest of the continent after defeating Germany. Consequently, the political landscape of Europe and the trajectory of the Cold War would have been entirely different had it not been for Churchill's leadership. In that sense, much like his ancestor and hero, John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, Winston Churchill altered the course of European history. Ultimately, the legacy of Sir Winston Churchill must be that, more than any other individual, he arguably saved Europe and possibly the entire world from the horrific dictatorships of either Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin, whose crimes were exponentially more severe and sinister than anything that occurred under the British Empire. His supporters assert that for this achievement alone, he should always be regarded as an international hero by all who cherish freedom. It is undeniable that the world is a better place for the life of Winston Churchill, Britain's greatest prime minister. What is your opinion of Winston Churchill? Was he Britain's greatest prime minister, or do some of his failures at other times, such as the Gallipoli campaign, and other mistakes and flaws detract from such a claim? Please share your thoughts in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.